Major development in the Supreme Court's clash with the Trump administration about the rule of law. They've had a lot of different ways that Trump officials have tried to test or sneak or maybe defy rulings at the lower court level. Supreme Court, of course, is the final word. And tonight we can report that is still the case in America. There was about 2 months of delay, but the Trump administration is now formally complying with the Supreme Court order to facilitate the return, that is, to bring back to America a man that they admitted they mistakenly deported, Abrego Garcia. He returns today from this El Salvador prison, and he will face new federal criminal charges. Garcia is named now in a new indictment that says he was transporting people not legally allowed to be in the country. And the Trump administration, which is now backing off claims that some of its officials made, including the Attorney General, that they didn't maybe have to comply or they couldn't comply or they weren't going to do anything. They are now trying on messaging to go on offense and present evidence against the detainee.
Our government presented El Salvador with an arrest warrant, and they agreed to return him to our country. The grand jury found that over the past 9 years, Abrego Garcia has played a significant role in an alien smuggling ring. They found this was his full-time job, not a contractor.
Now, that's actually how it is supposed to work. If the government has evidence against an individual, whether they're an undocumented immigrant or an American citizen, they present that evidence in court. Of course, we can follow that case to find out over time whether they win or lose those charges. That's how it's supposed to work, by the way. Now, they'd made this mistake in deportation, but what super boosted this all the way up to the Supreme Court was a suggestion that maybe the Trump administration wouldn't follow judicial orders. That was a big deal. And so the Trump administration, remember, lost in April at the Supreme Court level when the judges ordered the facilitation of Garcia's return. Now, that left some wiggle room, including some time, which you could argue is logical. The Supreme Court didn't say we have all the facts to know that he should be returned within 48 hours. They said facilitate his return. And initially, Trump officials made it sound like they weren't going to follow that at all. But there has been a backlash. There have been other court losses. There's been public criticism. And so, while we don't have the reporting to know whether the president and all his aides knew from day one they were always going to yield, or whether it was some of the public pressure that did it, what we're seeing here and what matters in the rule of law is that while this is what's supposed to happen, no one's talking about a celebration or a parade, it is also what some Trump officials brazenly threatened would not happen. They claimed today wouldn't come, that they might leave this open and test whether they could fully defy this order forever, and that didn't happen. Tonight, after some pressure, they are following exactly what the Supreme Court said, which was facilitate the return of this individual. We're joined by NYU law professor Melissa Murray. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. I'll put it like this, and I'm very curious how you think about this. This is exactly a case you might be teaching soon about constitutional law. On the one hand, we shouldn't be in this place. Very few former administrations in either party have taken us up to this line. And yet, on the other hand, after a bit of bluster, within about 7 to 8 weeks, they did follow the order. And that is different than the big, loud claims that they might not. How do you make sense of it?
Well, I will say 7 to 8 weeks, as you noted, is a long time. I think it's maybe generous to call it a bit of bluster. This was outward defiance of court orders, and I think it's important to draw a line under that. The administration has capitulated to the judiciary, but it's found a face-saving way to do so. They've indicted Mr. Abrego Garcia on criminal charges, and that has facilitated his return to the United States. But we cannot forget that for over a month, we had the president of the United States saying in interviews that although he had the capacity to do something, he had no inclination to do so. And we had members of his administration clearly defying the court. We had lawyers from the DOJ standing up before Judge Zinnes in the District of Maryland saying that they couldn't provide her with any information about where they were in their efforts to return him to the United States. And I think you have to think about it in those terms. There was still defiance that is shocking. You can tell that many of the judges that dealt with this case were absolutely shocked by just the clear defiance that the administration showed. And that's not typical. That's not usual. It's incredibly unorthodox. And I don't think we can lose sight of that just because we are now seeing him returned. I think ultimately what this shows is that keeping up the pressure, having both branches, the judiciary and Congress, be involved here is really important. I think it was meaningful that Senator Van Hollen went down to El Salvador,
Right.
that he was incredibly public about it. We haven't seen a lot of congressional intervention in the things that this administration is doing. There we did, and I think we're seeing a very different result. We also saw the force of public outcry here. I think all of that is important, and there are lots of lessons to be learned in that. But this is not a story about the courts saving us. This is a story about the courts being up against a wall and the administration finding a face-saving path out of it. But we're in a really precarious position here, and nothing about that has changed.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to lawyer you, Professor, but the Supreme Court, when they said facilitate, they also left this much room. If they'd put a time limit on it and said, hey, we've overseen enough immigrant cases that you can do this within 2 weeks, then that word you use, defiance, I think legally kicks in. Here, it seemed to me, and again, we can agree to disagree. That's the interesting part of these discussions we get to have with you. But it seemed to me that the Supreme Court was trying to avoid having a strict face-off like that this early. And some people around Trump said, oh, great, let's test this forever because, you know, the Stephen Millers want to do that. And then it would seem others said, wait a minute. There's a bunch of other cases heading back on the docket, including immigration cases. Why do we want to go to the mat over what is ultimately resolving the case of one individual? But I offer that to you for your response.
No, I think that's a very good point. It's also in the face of other challenges that are coming up to the court where the administration is succeeding in the face of really long odds. We had 2 orders issued today on the shadow docket in which the administration got what it wanted, which was a stay of an order to stop letting DOJ play around in people's private, sensitive Social Security Administration information. And there's a very spirited dissent from Justice Jackson saying that there's no world in which this would have been allowed in ordinary circumstances, that the government hasn't shown irreparable harm in this case. So, yes, I do think the administration probably made a calculated guess here that pushing on Mr. Abrego Garcia didn't make sense given the volume of cases that are percolating up to the Supreme Court. You know, they've cut bait here, and, you know, there's another avenue out here.